It's a real pleasure for us to be conducting this in the lead up to the HLPF and to see your strong engagement.
Let's take one step back what the situation was like before the pandemic. We knew that we had increasing inequality. We had a massive justice problem. We had unrest increasing. We had major conflicts around the world. What the pandemic did was to reinforce the existing inequalities, existing injustices.
COVID-19 has exposed our systemic vulnerabilities to cope with crises, one being the IFI-induced continued privatization in the healthcare sector, for example. However, the recently provided almost 76 out of 91 loans by IMF pushes for belt tightening that could further result in strategic cuts to public healthcare systems and social protection.
It is not only health crisis, but a humanitarian and socio-economic crisis, and it was repeated and repeated and repeated, and I think it's important to keep it in mind.
Suspend patents and lift trade rules that impede access to medicines and medical technologies for developing countries, including TRIPS waiver.
Given the significant shortage of vaccine provision in the global south and the serious uneven accessibility to vaccine across the world, we shall accelerate the technology transfer and the vaccine production across the world. This approach may have a more rapid and significant impact on vaccine production than the change in intellectual property rights regulation alone.
Through the pandemic, we have also seen very strong evidence from across the world that existing in-country inequalities have been a strong determinant of adverse and favorable outcomes from the pandemic itself.
And the situation of inequalities is even worse. As far as the Asia-Pacific region is concerned, less than 1% of its population is worth 54 times more than our least developing countries.
One of the major forms of inequalities demonstrated by this crisis is one relating to access to new and emerging technologies. And this has affected health, justice, education, and employment, among others.
That socioeconomic inequality overlap with racial, ethnic, minority, majority issues. Those cleavages overlapping make the anger grow and the polarization grow.
These shortfalls need to be contextualized in the multidimensional crises being lived by the people, characterized by inequitable access to essential services, severe wealth, power, and resources inequalities, environmental degradation, as well as the crises of governance and democratic rights.
Threat posed by organized crime, corruption, terrorism, and also illicit financial flows, and the fact that they need to be considered a key obstacle for sustainable development as a whole.
Rather than pushing the developing countries for economic self-reliance, financing for development processes should help them address macroeconomic pressures involving debt distress, hegemonic trade negotiations, involving liberalization, market deregulation, massive privatizations, and neoliberal instruments like ISDS, designed to plunder nation states of vital resources.
If we have this framework whereby we're talking about global health as a common good, then we can be particularly ambitious in pandemic preparedness. Because now we are almost improvising that kind of response. It should be automatic, no?
We also endorse the global call for permanent cancellation of all principal, interest, and charges on sovereign external debt, and it should not occur into future.
Child protection services, health and mental health, education, justice, and sustainable social protection are really a key package really to build back better.
Mobilize international support to ensure inclusive universal coverage for all the marginalized communities. It's also imperative to recognize that ODA is used to cement corporate capture, its substitution with climate financing, refugee costs or debt cancellation, or its use to achieve trade, military, and political objectives of donor countries is against the transformative ambitions of the Agenda 2030.